Homily. Evelyn, welcome. You may begin.
Thank you, Amanda, and it's a pleasure to be here. I'm grateful that you asked me to do this. So I'm going to share my screen and put up my. I'm a professor, not a minister, so you get a PowerPoint from me rather than a homily, but I'll try not to be too long. So I moved here, as Amanda said, a number of years ago, and I moved from the prairies. And I quite quickly realized that I didn't know the history of this territory. So part of what I did as my own act of decolonization was some research on the Lekwungen people who used to live here, their dwelling here, and the European myths and assumptions that led to their dispossession. I use the terminology Lekwungen. You will have heard that in the acknowledgement. It was the word that Elder George also used to talk about the indigenous people who historically and in the present as well live in this area that we call Victoria. So there are three myths that I wanted to talk about today. The first one is that the Lekwungen, oh, sorry, there. I skipped over one of my own slides. The three myths. The first, that the Lekwungen occupied only scattered villages and small gardens on southern Vancouver Island. The second myth is that the chiefs who signed the treaty owned Lekwungen territory. And the third one is that through the Victoria treaties, the Lekwungen ceded their territory. So first, some background. This is a map that shows the extent of Lekwungen daily rounds. In their annual cycle before the fort was built, the Lekwungen used the whole territory shown on the map. In spring, they clustered in the Cadboro Bay area and obtained canoe supplies from Cordova Bay. In early June, they crossed to the San Juan Islands for salmon fishing. Oops. In September, they were back in Cordova Bay for a time of dancing, feasting, berry picking. And then they crossed overland to the gorge area for game hunting. Also, by way of background, this is Governor George Douglas, and this is a copy of the Victoria Treaty signed in 1850. And you can see the X's of the people who signed the treaty. In 1850, Governor Douglas moved to formalize the relationship with the Lekwungen through a treaty. He wrote, and I quote, that he summoned to a conference the chiefs and influential men of the tribe. After considerable discussion, it was arranged that the whole of their lands forming the District of Victoria should be sold to the company, with the exception of village sites and enclosed fields, for a certain remuneration to be paid at once to each member of the tribe. Douglas promised that the Lekwungen were at liberty to continue to hunt on unoccupied lands and carry on with their fisheries. And payment was made in blankets, which was the currency the Lekwungen preferred, and it was the main measure of wealth in their society. Each man signing the treaty with an X was paid 3 blankets. This is an early map of the area around Victoria, and it blew me away the first time I saw it. This little square here is where Fort Victoria was built, now on Fort Street. All of the light green area was camas beds. This area up here is where the University of Victoria is. So now we see camas beds around Beacon Hill Park. But in 1850 or before, when the treaties were signed, it was a huge area that was a camas garden. So the first myth that I wanted to talk about was that the Lekwungen occupied only scattered villages and small gardens. Douglas's understanding is contained in a letter he wrote to the Hudson's Bay Company. I informed the natives that they would not be disturbed in their possession of village sites and enclosed fields, which are of a small extent. If you look at the camas beds, Lekwungen occupation of the territory through gardening is not a small enclosed garden area, it's huge. But the settlers had very little understanding of Lekwungen gardening, or the way in which Lekwungen managed their lands. So Douglas described this area as a perfect Eden that dropped from the clouds. And he wrote that it was the most picturesque and decidedly valuable part of the island that we had the good fortune to discover. And earlier, George Vancouver wrote about extensive spaces that wore the appearance of having been cleared by art. In fact, these seemingly untouched natural plains, which settlers considered to present prime opportunities for agriculture, had been cultivated by the Lekwungen women for decades. Camas bulbs provided the Lekwungen staple diet of carbohydrates. Fields were managed through annual burning. The Lekwungen women weeded these fields, removed rocks, loosened the soil to encourage growth, fertilized them with seaweed, and replanted bulbs to ensure a constant supply. Camas bulbs were at the basis of a huge trade network that supplied distant tribes with carbohydrates in the form of a kind of fruit leather that would travel and keep. Settlers gradually took over and destroyed these camas beds. And the first time I heard about this, I couldn't imagine what it must have felt like for the Lekwungen to see people plowing up the camas beds, to see the settlers grazing their cattle on them, and to be gradually prevented from using them. When the Lekwungen resisted by harvesting some of the cattle grazed on their camas gardens, the Hudson's Bay Company demanded restitution. When the Lekwungen resisted, after all, the cattle had been fed by the Lekwungen gardens, the Hudson's Bay Company fired a cannon into the chief's house and destroyed it. In this way, Lekwungen territories were obtained by a show of force. Similarly, settlers also didn't recognize that the Lekwungen didn't just harvest other resources such as fish and game, but actively managed them to preserve the harvest. Settlers took over these resources too, without compensation. So a second myth was that the signatures of the 1850 Victoria Treaty owned Lekwungen territory. There are major discrepancies between the ethnographic realities of Lekwungen society in the 1850s and the situation that treaties assumed to exist. The 1850 treaty was based in European concepts. It included ideas that families or tribes owned the land, that each of them owned a single tract whose boundaries could be defined, that ownership was exclusive, that the current owner could sell the land, and that all the land in question was owned by one or the other of the named groups. This map is based on the descriptions that are contained in the 1850 treaty. The territories weren't fully enclosed because the treaty described general locations, but was not accompanied by the map. This treaty comes from an article by Wilson Duff, an anthropologist who interacted with the Lekwungen people in the 1850s and 60s. And it lists the names of the signatories to the treaty. The reality was that Lekwungen had a much more intricate system of property relations than the treaty and the British assumed. First of all, valuable resource gathering sites, such as reef net locations, seal rocks, and camas beds, were associated with extended families, which stewarded and managed the use of these resources. This was both a right and a responsibility. UVic historian John Lutz writes that with respect to the fishing site, and this is a quote, "It was not so much that the Lekwungen owned the reef net sites as that families belonged to the fishing sites. The Lekwungen had a similar relationship with other resource sites. Lutz has suggested that the treaty boundaries on this map were in fact outlines of the family camas beds. Secondly, it was a much larger group, the Lekwungen as a whole, that exercised common ownership over such shared areas as the Cedar Hill forests, the hunting territories near the gorge, the clam beds that the hotel now sits on, and other resources. The assumption that each group owned just a single tract of land fails to account for such shared resources. And thirdly, ownership or responsibility was inherited or passed on by marriage, not bought. And it was renewed by distributing resource supplies or surpluses, at feasts or potlatches. By giving away wealth at a potlatch, the giver obtained or renewed access to other resources than those of their particular extended families. In other words, boundaries were permeable, and access to resources could not accurately be represented by lines on a map. As a result, Duff Wilson, the anthropologist I mentioned, considered the Victoria Treaty an ethnographic absurdity. The last myth that I wanted to talk about was that through the treaty, the Lekwungen ceded their territory. The account of the 1850 treaty from the Lekwungen perspective by Chief David Lettice was that Douglas, and this is a quote, assured the chiefs that trade in furs with peaceful use of enough land to grow food were the only reasons for establishment of the settlement. His statement was welcomed by the peace-loving tribes, whose view of the settlement, had it been voiced at all, would have been that there was lots of land and no harm could come from letting the whites use some of it. We all understood that similar gifts would be made each year, what is now called rent, unquote. Lutz, the Yuvik historian, suggests that, and this is another quote, probably the Lekwungen thought they were being compensated for lands, particularly the camas patches, that had already been occupied. Since this land had been taken, and it did not look like the Lekwungen could get it back, some payment was probably accepted as better than none, unquote. Also, Douglas's ceremony mirrored the potlatch, a public ceremony in which rights were proclaimed and gifts distributed. Lutz writes again, like other claims to ownership in the Lekwungen worldview, this one would need to be periodically revalidated with a feast and gifts. Like other potlatches, it put the givers and the receivers in a moral obligation to continue a reciprocal gift-giving cycle. Finally, the view that the Lekwungen belonged to the land rather than the other way around makes it very unlikely that they consented, in the words of the treaty, to surrender entirely their territory and forever to James Douglas, the agent of the Hudson's Bay Company. So in conclusion, instead of occupying only scattered villages, the Lekwungen managed all of their territory, although the Europeans with their European sense of superiority didn't see the way that the Lekwungen managed and governed their territories. Second, the Lekwungen had a sophisticated relationship to their territory that was not reflected in the treaty. They didn't only subsist on and occupy the land, they governed it, they managed it. And this governance was not reflected in the territory. And third, like other First Nations in Canada, the Lekwungen had no frame of reference for the idea of ceding their territory. It's highly unlikely that they understood that the British were saying that they had given up their land. All these events happened many years ago, but they still have relevance today. A number of us recently participated in a study of a film produced by the Anglican Church on the doctrine of discovery. Amanda mentioned it earlier. The doctrine of discovery is basically a doctrine based on 14th century rules governing colonization. And it assumed that Indigenous people did not have the capacity to govern their societies and manage their lands. Lekwungen history shows that exactly the same attitude was the basis of treaty making and dispossession in this area. There's much talk these days of reconciliation and decolonization. I would argue that if we want to move in this direction, we need, at the very least, to know some of the history that underlines our dwelling on this beautiful land. And this is some of what I tried to summarize for you today. Thank you.
Evelyn, thank you